Welcome. Thank you, everyone, for being here. We are excited to bat lead off here on our first panel, which is For Our Freedom, Protecting U.S. Elections from Foreign Money Interference. I am joined today by a remarkable panel of folks here. I will start with, to my immediate left, Josh Huminski, who is the director of the Mike Rogers Center for Intelligence and Global Affairs, which resides within the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. Josh is an expert on a number of things and is frequently quoted, but does a lot of work with the Strategic Competition Program, focusing on the U.S.-European relationships, and a lot of Russian-related work streams coming out of the center. To his left, we have Catie Kelley, who is the Senior Director of Policy and Strategic Partnerships at the Campaign Legal Center. Catie oversees all of the policy work done by the Legal Center on the federal, state, and local levels, and has a specific focus on election sabotage, which I think is going to be very interesting to hear about. To her left, Colonel Larry Wilkerson. After 31 years in the Army, Colonel Wilkerson served as Chief of Staff to Secretary of State Colin Powell. He continues to be a resource for policymakers and decision makers on the Hill. He currently serves as a professor at William and Mary in public policy and government. Please welcome our panelists here today. For as long as our country's been in existence, foreign countries have tried to exert their influence on us from the very beginning, militarily, economically, culturally. So this is nothing new. But what is new now is that the technology is now caught up that's made it a whole lot easier for them. Not only the technology, but now legally, we have this massive loophole due to the Citizens United ruling, where foreign countries and foreign entities have now been able to come in, spend money legally. I think our friends in Maine are going to talk to you a little later about what they witnessed and what they had to go through and what we're trying to do to rectify the situation where you had a foreign-owned entity come in and spend tens of millions of dollars to influence an election, and the FEC basically said, okay, you can do that. So that's going to be a very interesting panel to listen to later. Democrats and Republicans in Congress have both identified this issue. Everybody saw, I think, some of the hearings that came out from the interference in the 2016 election and in 2020, but it doesn't seem like anyone's taken any significant steps to address that. So we'll talk about that as well. Just recently, the New York Times published an article a couple weeks ago that Vladimir Putin has spent over $300 million influencing elections across the world since 2014, including here in the United States. And I'm sure our panelists here are going to talk about that as well. So let's start with Josh. Josh, can you kind of frame the issue in a geopolitical global context of kind of what we're facing here? Who are some of the bad actors, and what are we seeing over the horizon a little bit over the next 12 to 24 months?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a risk that when we look at what's happening right now of presentism, we see this as something that's unique and novel to us right now. But if you have to go back and look at the experience of the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War, the Soviet Union was prolific in political warfare and active measures and undermining elections and attempting to influence the outcome of political debates and discussions. I mean, famously, they bought off two politicians to ensure that Willy Brandt in West Germany was reelected, so they survived a vote of no confidence. And so that's just an indication of what they do and how they operate. What happened is that when the Cold War ended, the United States took its eye off the ball, where we had a very well-developed apparatus to combat political warfare, to fight the sort of intelligence fight, the skullduggery, if you will, of that environment. That went away because we had won, in inverted commas, the Cold War. The Soviet Union was no longer present, and we were in a new environment, a new era. The reality of the situation is that the threat from Moscow in particular never really went away. I highly recommend people pick up Catherine Belton's Putin's People, book. It's a fantastic exploration of what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the extent to which Russia worked to create alternative funding mechanisms to pursue its influence operations, as well as for personal and private gain of the oligarchs. But it creates sort of black pots of money where they can influence global events and global affairs. Bill's absolutely right. I mean, we know about 300 million from 2014. That's what we know about. And undoubtedly, there's an amount that we don't know about, and we're not paying attention to it. You know, the British government, the Intelligence Security Committee report that came out after Brexit basically said that they weren't paying attention to it, despite the fact that oligarchs were buying up Mayfair and the very high-end properties there. So when you look at the panoply of tools that Russia has, in particular, to influence global affairs and global events, it's buying off politicians, influencing far left and far right parties. There's been plenty of evidence across Europe, Western Europe in particular, of their efforts to do this. It is active measures campaigns. It is propaganda, as Bill had mentioned as well. It is the use of social media. And I think this is a situation that we found in 2016, was that the prior Obama administration, to their credit, was very focused and very concerned about the integrity of the election itself. How were the votes going to be protected? Was there a potential for tampering? And the prospect of actual influence operations via social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, was not something that people were really paying attention to outside of certain communities. So if we fast forward where we are today, post-Ukraine, and all credit and the admiration to the Ukrainian people for their defense of their homeland against Russian aggression, expanded invasion. Fast forward, I think there's a risk that we assume that Russia will not be able to mount these types of operations in the future. That's patently false. If anything, Russia will seek to use active measures, political warfare, information warfare, cyber operations to an even greater degree in the coming years, because their ability to influence Western activity, particularly Western European activity, and American influence is going to be markedly cut short because of sanctions, trade embargoes, political isolation, and what have you.
Terrific. Catie, let's go to you. Foreign money in our elections is one of the number of ways that our adversaries look to destabilize us. The Campaign Legal Center does a great job at tracking the threats, the number of threats to our elections and our democracy. Can you give us a little view into sort of the threat landscape that you see in 22 and into 24, heading into the presidential election, that you've seen from the Legal Center?
Yeah, sure. Unfortunately, the threat landscape is pretty much the same, because there has not been many successful efforts to address the problem of foreign money in our elections. And just to say a little bit about the legal framework of how it's coming in, there is a federal ban on foreign nationals contributing to our elections, and that's both contributing directly to candidates and spending to influence the outcome of elections. Unlike most provisions of federal law, this actually applies both to the state and local levels. Most federal campaign finance laws only apply to federal campaigns, but this ban in federal law regarding foreign national spending in elections applies to the state and local level as well. As Jeff teed up in his intro remarks, the Supreme Court, of course, has made the dark money spending possible to hide the foreign money that's coming into the elections. And so we have money coming in from corporations that have foreign control, C4s that are funded by foreign entities, LLCs that are set up to hide foreign money coming in. So that's how the money is coming into the elections by and large. Another key piece of this is digital ads, and as Joshua was mentioning, Russia's ability to meddle in our elections mostly through digital ads, and there are not the same disclosure and disclaimer requirements as there are for digital ads as there are for TV and broadcast. So we have outdated laws written to cover campaigns run using TV, using radio, and Congress has not updated them to adjust for the digital age, and we're in desperate need to provide the same level of transparency for that digital political ad spending as we get in broadcast ads. So that's another way the money is coming in, is through digital ads, and so need for more transparency there. The other piece, as Bill mentioned, is foreign spending on ballot initiatives. Again, Supreme Court has put us in this mess. Congress has not acted to update the laws, but I can't be on any public speaking panel without pointing the finger at FEC as well, because they interpreted the federal ban on contributions to elections to apply only to candidate elections and said it's fine. You can go ahead and spend foreign money to influence ballot initiatives, which is pretty crazy. You know, this is our means of direct democracy, the most immediate way for citizens to have a say in the laws on the books in our country, and yet we're allowing unlimited foreign money to come in to influence these ballot initiatives. So that's kind of the landscape of how the money is coming in. And again, a lot of it is illegal, but we don't have the transparency we need to uncover it, and the dark money is hiding the foreign money.
So Catie, in terms of the outdated laws, right? So let's go to Congress. We have a couple of members that will be here later today, Dean Phillips, John Katko, who I think understand the threats and have tried to advance legislation to address some of these issues. The Disclose Act was voted down along party lines last week. Inevitably, politics gets involved in the political process. But do you have, from your standpoint, are there any champions on Capitol Hill that we can look to? And are there any other pieces of legislation that you think are important to advance? We're going tomorrow to meet with our members of Congress. What can we express to them? What pieces of legislation can we express? Can we push in front of them that you think would address some of these issues that we can do from a statutory standpoint?
Right. The Disclose Act is a great example, and I will say a little bit more about in terms of the process too, because I think that's important. And again, we have policy solutions. I think that's the good news, that there are ways we can address this, and there's some really thoughtful legislation that has been introduced that could help provide transparency and again update the laws to cover some of the foreign spending that's coming in. So good news there. Senator Whitehouse has been a real champion of the Disclose Act and was really committed to having a vote on that piece of legislation before the midterms. And you need 60 votes to open a debate in the Senate. Couldn't get the 60 votes to open the debate, and that's where it ended for the Disclose Act last week. So that's a big disappointment. Representative Spanberger has also been a huge champion of really pushing measures for stopping foreign spending in our elections. So there are champions on the Hill, and they're, I think that this shouldn't be a partisan issue. And I will say the thing that does give me some hope on the potential for some compromise and some dialogue on elections issues is the Senate is moving a very solid Electoral Count Reform Act bill, and there was a vote in the Senate Rules Committee yesterday to advance this bill to the full Senate, and I think we'll see a vote on that in the lame duck. This was an agreement hammered out by Republicans and Democrats in the Senate to address the problems with the Electoral Count Act. So, this is not something that's going to address the foreign spending issue, but I think there are some glimmers of hope in terms of flexing that compromise muscle and remembering how to work together to advance legislation that we really need.
Terrific. Colonel, your expertise and your experience starting in Vietnam, you started in Vietnam, your career took you to the Pentagon, to Foggy Bottom, to the White House. You've seen a lot over the past few decades that you've served. What do you see compared to this time in history? What's your worry given the current state of our democracy based on the times that you've seen through some of the most dangerous times in our history over the past 50 years? And have the scope and the size of the threats, have those to our elections and our democracy, or do you think those are greater than they were during the Cold War?
I compare the period today and have publicly said it to 1857, 1858, 1859. If you know anything about that period and what followed, you know how dangerous this period is. But my really recent information in this regard doesn't come from the scholars at William & Mary, though we have some quite good ones down there on things like elections. It comes from my experience since the summer of 2019 when I joined something called the National Task Force for Election Crises. About 65 people who met periodically, experts in everything from the Electoral College to just state actions, and they're all different, which is a unique thing about our country, in elections, whether they be state or national. And then my involvement with a group out of the Georgetown Law School, you may have heard of, it got a lot of notoriety, the Transition Integrity Project, where we had such an eclectic audience that we had David Frum and Bill Kristol in the room with us. At the same time, we had Democrats in the room with us whose names I can't announce because they wouldn't let me. Bill and David essentially said, you can tell anybody about us. Our claim to fame, you may have read about, was predicting January the 6th. We wargame the 2020 elections. And one of our worst case scenarios actually developed, much like January the 6th. We didn't take it beyond that evolution, if you will, because we were frightened to take it beyond that evolution, frankly. We didn't know what was going to happen. We had divided opinion in the group. All this to say that I was exposed to a number of experts from, for example, at that time, Google Alphabet's principal technology expert who gave us a briefing that really blew us away. We'd never seen anything like this. It was based on Russian interference in elections across the globe, but principally ours. And one of the things we learned from that briefing, which has, in my view, not really been explored by the mainstream media, various reasons for that, is the influence that the Russians had on the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. They climbed into that process and saw what anybody who's smart in this sees, that you only need to influence 0.5%, maybe 1% of the vote. And that's not that difficult to do, especially when you're backed with storehouse of money. And so they did. And it's my considered estimation that the Brexit vote went the way it did, whatever its results ultimately are. I think they will be deleterious to the United Kingdom and to NATO and to Europe in general, was influenced to the point that it was an evolution the Russians wanted and got. That's not to say that they're going to do that every time. I mean, let's face it, in 1948, Harry Truman started putting millions of dollars into elections to try and keep the communists from being elected in Italy. And we've been doing it ever since. So it's something that nations do, especially great powers or near great powers. But it's very disturbing now when you get these kinds of briefings and you see how sophisticated these operations are. Now, let me give just one example and I'll conclude. We watched a 45-minute TV video of election campaigning all across America. And then we were told that the people we had watched in that campaign, who came across as housewives, preachers, businessmen and women and so forth, were Russian creations. They didn't even exist. They did have a passport, an ID card of sorts. They had a tax number. They had an address, a telephone number, a series of telephone numbers, cell phones and everything, but they didn't exist. They were composite people made up by a very sophisticated program that then went into the American media and broadcast themselves in ways that were designed to cause dissension, to cause fighting, to cause votes to go one way or the other, and so forth. And this was all backed by money. And it was questionable, really questionable, as to whose money.
So let's go to that, because we've been very focused on Russia for obvious reasons. It's in the forefront of all the news right now. Joshua, can you talk to us about some of the other countries that have spent and tried to interfere in our elections as well, how they've done that, what they've done, and where are they out of?
I want to comment on the Colonel's point, actually, as if I may, just to start
Of
off
course.
point. It brings a really great point, is that the bang for the buck ratio is fundamentally changing. With the technology that is out there in terms of deep fakes and various simulations of people, you can achieve a great deal of impact for a lot cheaper money. And that's something that is going to be increasingly challenging going forward. So, the Internet Research Agency is believed to have spent, X number of hundreds of thousands of dollars on ads, but reached, how many million people. Now, extrapolate that forward, and depending if the rules do not change, if the disclosure rules don't change, and you're looking at a situation where you're spending $500,000 to reach a half billion people for the sake of argument. That ratio will fundamentally get more complicated as technology further and further advances. So it's a challenge for policymakers to stay ahead of that, both in terms of legislative side to say how money is getting into the system, but then also what that money can actually achieve. Because there's fundamentally an order of magnitude difference from mobilizing a campaign like Bill had talked about when he was in high school versus me programming a series of bots to produce deep fakes and go influence everybody. And it only needs to take one message to sync. I can do 100,000 messages, but if that one bites, that influence will have outsized effect. To your question, I mean, what we're seeing is other countries adopting Russia's playbook and doing it quite well in an evolutionary standpoint. I'm going to bring up Australia as an example, as a target from China in particular. Australia has been a big target for Beijing across the board, from almost outright buying politicians to creating fake board positions in nonprofits and think tanks for foreign politicians, to buying influence that way, so they have pro-Beijing narratives. They're facilitating sort of grassroots and grass tops initiatives that appear to be legitimate, but they're fully funded effectively through assets and organizations from the Chinese government. And so you're seeing that, and Australia, to their credit, is doing a great deal of work to crack down on this, having been considerably more permissive than they once were, than they are now, I should say.
Now, are there things that Australia's done that we can look to address these issues and that sort of influence, outside influence?
I think what they're doing is for one, it's a lot of naming and shaming and identifying politicians and holding, journalists are holding politicians to account when they have these things popping up. I think is a big one. Having an informed and aware, educated citizenry is another one. Trying to close off some of these loopholes that you're seeing pop up to allow astroturfing to develop in terms of financial mechanisms. But it is a robust and challenging effort because when you do one thing, your adversary is going to respond. So if we create a law here that's going to say, hey, you need to disclose your online ads, they're going to say, okay, great, I'm going to go find an agent, for lack of a better phrase, who will serve as my vehicle in the United States to provide that money. Be it a overseas Chinese expatriate, for the sake of argument, or a Chinese naturalized citizen, or whomever. Or what we've also seen, and I may get this wrong, I think it was either Russia or Iran, but it might have been Russia, was recruiting journalists for outlets that they didn't know they were actually writing for Russia or Iran. I get that story mixed up. And so when it became disclosed that these journalists, they thought they were writing for this outlet, and it actually turns out it was fundamentally funded by a foreign government to push a specific narrative. So what you're seeing is the proliferation of these tools and capabilities from a Russian playbook to Iran, to China, to eventually North Korea and other adversaries.
Catie, we've seen in the New York Times article that I mentioned before about Vladimir Putin, there were a number of mechanisms in there that he's utilized. Cryptocurrency, cutouts, foundations, board seats that Josh referenced. Have you seen this, where have you seen this in the United States? Have we been able to identify or shine a light on any of this, of what's been happening here in the US with particular institutions or particular groups here in the US?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, again, the money, a lot of it is undisclosed, so we don't have a sense of the scale, a lot of this, and a lot of how we are uncovering instances of the foreign spending is either people will admit that they have done this. That happened with the case of a Chinese-owned corporation that made, I think, a very sizable contribution to a super PAC supporting Jeb Bush in 2020. And the individual that made the contribution just said that he did it. And, so great, but we can't really depend on people admitting in print that they have done this. And a lot of it too is, organizations like the Campaign Legal Center are monitoring filings. And so we were able to unearth the Lev Partisan Fruman contribution going to a Trump-aligned super PAC through an LLC that was created, just days before the contribution was made. And so, took some digging on our end into who is this LLC that popped up out of nowhere and is making contributions to this Trump-aligned super PAC. And we didn't have to do too much digging to see that it looked like it was some sort of shell entity set up to funnel the money in. But again, we can't rely on organizations who are, we don't have the resources to check all of these things, and we can't, again, expect people to be admitting it in print. So we need, I think the transparency piece is key to begin to get a hold of what's going on.
Sure. Colonel, how do we pull ourselves back from the brink? From what you said, you have serious concerns about where we are as a country, as a democracy, as a people. With your time in government, your time with what you're involved with now, how do we, other than passing the 28th Amendment to ensure that we can keep dark money out of politics, how can we pull ourselves back together, Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated? How can we do that?
Well, I do think the 28th Amendment is absolutely vital. If you haven't read Nancy McPherson, the history professor at Duke, her book, Democracy in Chains, so that you understand how we got to where we are, how we got to Citizens United. It's an explicit expose done by an eminent historian on how we created Citizens United. And the way we were able to do that was because we went to sleep, we being the American people. We let it happen. We let Lewis Powell write the memo that said corporate America should run America, not the people. And then we let Charles Koch allocate billions of dollars, gather to himself ally after ally, discard them when they weren't working for him anymore, keep them if they did, and make more profound their efforts, which produce what we have today. Not just the Supreme Court decision, but the fact that if there's a deep state, it is corporate America. That's what's running your government now. And if you want to take that government back, and I tell audiences all across America this, I'm guilty, you're guilty. We have gone to sleep on our republic. And if we don't awaken and take it back, at least as much as possible in this modern age, we're going to forfeit it. It's that simple. So it's people like you and others like you all across this country that have to resume their participation, educated, competent participation in our democratic process, whether it's at the polling stations in Colorado or it's in opposing Colorado's congresswoman who wants to make Christianity the national religion and my and your armed forces its protector. Lauren Boebert, listen to her sometimes. These are dangerous people. And they only arrived where they arrived at a position of power in your legislature. Read the Constitution. That's the people's part of government, the legislature, not the executive branch. For 4 years, they're on their own, really. Not the courts, as we've seen so clearly. It's the legislature. They're the people's representatives. They're where James Madison and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton and George Washington thought the real people power resided. Well, they've gone to sleep on the job. They are corrupted and polluted with money. The only thing that's going to change that is you and others like you.
So we have a question from the audience. I think you have some cards on your tables. If you have some questions, feel free to write them down. Liz is walking around with them. We have a question from the audience. Catie, we'll do this for you. Prior to an amendment, can we envision a foreign money carve-out that would get past the Senate 60 votes for a floor debate? Maybe that goes to the Disclose Act?
Yeah, I mean, the Disclose Act had some really great foreign money provisions. It also had some transparency provisions. So maybe a bill just focused on the foreign money piece could make it. And there's been a lot of Republican opposition to the transparency pieces that were part of Disclose for many years. So I sure hope that they'd be willing to give that a try too. We need both, but I think that we all have to be realistic about incremental change when it comes to federal legislation right now, and it has to be bipartisan. We're not going to pass anything along party lines. So what pieces of this could we get done in a bipartisan Senate? So I hope that certainly extending the foreign national contribution ban to cover ballot initiatives is one piece that hopefully I think that the Senate could do. Hope that they would be willing to take a look at that and some of the other provisions of Disclose. that would prevent these shell corporations from popping up to hide foreign money.
Terrific. All right, here's another one we have coming in. I use factchecker.com to look into the validity of statements made in political ads. Are groups like factchecker.com free from outside interference? Is a really good question. Colonel, the concern could be obviously that our adversaries are funding these so-called fact-checking websites. Is there a website that you use to try to validate some of the statements that you see or some of the issues that you see presented to people? I mean, this probably is a valid concern to make sure that we're not going to any website because we don't really know who runs these websites. Colonel Josh, anything that you use or any concerns that you've seen?
This is going to sound strange, perhaps, especially for a person who spent 45 years in the government. My sources now are my network. I don't pay any attention to social media, except if someone directs me to something that's particularly egregious that I want to see. 60% of the internet is sex and gambling. That'll give you some indication of what we're doing to ourselves. Anyone will tell you that too, whether it's Treasury, FBI, whatever. 60% of the internet, I think it's even more, is gambling and sex. I've got a network that I've built up over the years of trusted confidants, people I know inside the government and outside, and we email all the time. And that's how I get my information. And it's mostly reliable information. It's people I trust, it's people I've known for years, it's people whose views I respect, and they might be different political views from mine, but I know they're patriots, I know they're concerned about this country and its future. You cannot get the message, as it were, from media today. You just simply can't. Whether it's social media, it's on the internet, or it's in the New York Times. I don't even take the New York Times or the Washington Post anymore. Occasionally I read the Financial Times because I have some friends who write for the London Financial Times, and I know they write well and are usually right, especially about Europe. And I'm very concerned about 750 million people who have a GDP the equivalent of ours and can't get their political act together and are now featuring a war in their very midst. That's a real concern. I'm also concerned about nuclear weapons. We have no treaties left, period. They're all gone. The ABM Treaty, the Open Skies Treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, the INF Treaty, and ultimately New START, which we just renewed with Putin, and I'll give you two guesses, and the first one doesn't count as to what Putin's going to say to that. We have no nuclear arms control, and we are building in this country $1.2 trillion of new nuclear weapons. This is disaster. Disaster. And we aren't even paying attention to it. And then we've got the climate crisis. We really need to get our act together fast.
Josh?
If I may, just to jump on that, not specifically about the veracity or validity of fact-checking organizations, but what this all speaks to is a fundamental erosion of trust in institutions. And that is a problem that is endemic to the United States right now at nearly every level in terms of the discussions that are taking place over the couple days here. But it is something on which foreign adversaries fundamentally seize. Now, they will exploit whatever divisions that we have. They will not create them. And we certainly saw that in 2016, in 2020. We can anticipate seeing it this year, in 2024, and going forward, because it's what the playbook was during the Cold War and the Soviet Union in particular. What we can do is work to solidify the institutions here at home and try to find those common sense solutions, which Catie was outlining, in terms of working to address legislation, to close the loopholes, to rebuild faith in institutions and in the country. And the problem right now is that we are splitting out ourselves, and our adversaries are just kind of throwing little wedges in there that's kind of helping it. And working together to find common sense bipartisan solutions, to make bipartisanship not a four-letter word anymore, is a way that's going to kind of bring things together and close those avenues off to adversarial exploitation. They're never going to stop. I mean, we could be a perfectly whole society agreeing on everything tomorrow, and I guarantee Beijing and Moscow are going to be looking for those little divisions to try to split. Because what they want to do is undermine the institutions. They don't necessarily want a specific outcome, although they may have a preferential outcome. What they want to do is induce chaos into the system. And we are creating chaos on ourselves, and they're just stoking the fire along.
What a way to kick off this conference, huh? How about that? Colonel Wilkerson, Catie, Kelley, Joshua Huminski, thank you so much. Thank you.